Hi, everyone. This is Teacher Jamie or Professor Z, whichever you prefer. Welcome to English 108. I'm going to give a short lecture about this course and what it's designed to do. And what I'm basically going to do is go over what disciplines are and how they differ and how they structure themselves. So usually I would start a class. If I had a face-to-face class, I would ask students if they know what a discipline is, and I usually get a lot of sort of confused looks. Students aren't used to kind of thinking in the ways in which a college is organized. So a discipline is a way of thinking. It's and in college you're going to have different departments that have different fields of study, and each field of study is going to have its own way of thinking about the world or about the thing that they study. So a sociologist is going to think about something very differently than a scientist is going to think about something, who's going to think about it very differently from how a historian might or how a business person might. So across a college, you get a lot of different ways of looking at things. And sometimes students find that a little annoying, let's say. They would like it to be clear cut across the disciplines, but unfortunately, college is not quite so neat. So, what makes a discipline? So, a discipline, it builds on itself. So, an example I like to give is the discipline of psychology. It more or less starts with Sigmund Freud, and then everyone kind of coming after Sigmund Freud is often in conversation with his work, is challenging his work or building upon it. Similarly, in like philosophy, a lot of philosophical discussion goes all the way back to Plato, and modern philosophers are again challenging Plato or agreeing with him or building on his insights. Um, and like I said before, disciplines are going to look at the same thing in different ways, and every discipline is going to have questions that they're trying to answer. And a lot of times there's very vigorous debate, and there are two sides or three sides to an issue. Okay. So each discipline is going to ask its own questions. It's going to, like I said, have its own controversies, and it's also going to have its own way of communicating. Another thing that you're going to probably find challenging in college is that your English professor is going to ask you to write a paper one way, then your bio lab professor is going to ask you to communicate in a different way, and then your sociology professor is going to tell you to cite things differently. So you're going to have to learn the ways of communication in each discipline. Another thing that differentiates disciplines is they often have their own discipline specific vocabulary. So there will be jargon or vocabulary that's very specific to a discipline and that everyone working in that discipline knows, but it may be very unfamiliar to those of us who are not versed in it. So when you enter into, say, you go into your bio class, you come into your English class, you're going to have to learn that vocabulary. And I point that out because I don't want you to get stressed out like, oh, I don't know this, I'm dumb. That's not the case. What it is you've just never been exposed to it before. Nobody has who is not involved in that discipline. And so you're going to want to just get yourself familiar with that language, and it's going to be easier to enter those conversations. And another question you may be having at this point is like, why? Why do I got to do this? I just want to be a nurse. Why do I got to do English? Why do I got to do math? Why I got to do all these things, right? So every college is going to require students to do a core curriculum. Okay. So what that means is you're going to have to take classes across the discipline. Okay. And I'll tell you a little bit about the rationale for that in a minute. But what you want to do is you want to start to look for connections across disciplines, and connections can be ways that they do things similarly or differently. And what I will tell you is that being a generalist is going to make you a better specialist, right? So I teach, I haven't recently, but I used to teach engineers at Drexel, right? And my engineers were always looking at me like, why do I got to take your stupid English class? I don't want to learn English, right? And what I told them is you're all going to be good engineers, but what's going to separate the the best from the not so best is that if you're able to communicate your ideas, right, to the non-specialist, you're going to get further, right? So a lot of times just um, also knowing all the different disciplines gives you more to pull on in your own field, okay? And you're able to make connections that other people aren't. So a lot of times things that don't seem to have a lot of value will have a lot of value for you if you can kind of think imaginatively about how they might. So your professors are going to ask you really different, they're going to have very, very different expectations of you based on their discipline, right? A professor of biology is going to talk to you about experiments and comparing results. A professor in a poetry class is going to want you to interpret lines of poetry, which is very different. A professor of history is going to expect you to do a lot of research, and they're going to talk a lot about firsthand sources, primary sources, and secondary sources, and being able to differentiate between those things. In a language class, they may be asking you to do comparative work between languages. Um, a professor of marketing is going to be much more applied, like, hey, choose something from the real world and look at the marketing techniques and analyze them based on what you're learning in class. So each professor is going to, the material, the content is going to be different, of course, but also the things they ask you to do with that content is going to be different. So what are the disciplines? Okay. So most colleges have 4 or 5 different housings or different groups. Okay. There are the natural and physical sciences, the humanities, social sciences, the applied sciences, and sometimes some people say there's a 5th, which is the formal sciences. And that grouping would be like mathematics and some types of philosophy, like formal logic. So the social sciences is what I'm going to start with, and these are some examples here of social sciences. So anthropology, geography, political science, psychology, and economics. What do all these disciplines have in common? Well, they all study human behavior, and sociology in particular looks at the human behavior of groups. Okay. Economics might look at behavior around making rational decisions. Okay, they have different things, but they're looking at group behavior, human behavior. And so for sociologists, they're going to look at a social group. They're going to look at how a social group is formed, how social groups interact, and that's the thing that they study. I'm going to give you a concrete example. I'm going to look at the Black Lives Matter movement through a number of different perspectives in this slideshow. So from a sociological perspective, right? A researcher who's a sociologist, they might look at Black Lives Matter and say, well, what informs group identity for this group of people? How is its identity shaped by being how is a person's identity shaped by being a part of this group or by not being a part of that group? They also might look at the movement through different language and terms and concepts in the discipline, right? So deviance is a popular concept that's used in sociology and has to do with like how do groups challenge the status quo, right? So they might look at it like how is this or is this not an example of deviance? They might look at Black Lives Matter through social movements. You see, I have a typo there, socials. Or they might look at it and think about how power is being constructed by the group. So that would be a discipline-specific perspective on Black Lives Matter. Now let's look at the natural sciences. Here you've got the life sciences, chemistry, physics, earth sciences, such as geology and environmental science. Now, here's a question for you. How might these disciplines look at the Black Lives Matter movement? It might seem like a bit of a stretch, right? What do these disciplines have to do with that? But with almost any phenomenon or object, every discipline has something in it that would interest them. So from a biological perspective, right? Let me just talk a little bit more, about these disciplines, about the natural sciences. So they're going to try to know the physical world through observation and through testing. And they're all going to use some form of the scientific method where they're going to start with a question, they're going to do research and see what past researchers in their field have discovered about it. They're going to then develop their own hypothesis, which is what they want to test. Then they're going to go out and test it and analyze their results, and then they communicate their results once they have done that. So here's how a geneticist, for example, might think about Black Lives Matter, right? Their question might be, does race even exist? Is that a thing, or is that a social construct, right? And so then they're going to walk through, they're going to use the scientific method, because that is the language of their field, to conduct, to get an answer to their question. So they're going to start with research, right? what have past geneticists concluded? And they may find there's a lot of research or not a lot of research. And eventually they're going to come up with their own hypothesis, which is kind of like their tentative thesis, right? They're going to say maybe, I think race is a social construct and that this idea of 5 races, which is something they found in their research, is a myth. So then they're going to go and collect data. If I'm a geneticist, I'm interested in genetic data, right? So I'm going to look at genome data. And say I look at it and I find there's just a 0.1% variation across so-called races. Well, then I can start to say, this is a myth, right? This is not something that exists. It's a social construct. So if I'm a geneticist, clearly I'm looking at this much differently than if I'm a sociologist, right? They're both looking at Black Lives Matter in really different ways. Okay, third field of disciplines, third large grouping, is the humanities, which is going to include history, philosophy, literature, art, music, these types of fields. Humanities is going to investigate how humans create meaning. It asks usually interpretive questions, right? Like, so why did Rome fall? Or what's the meaning of this movie or this poem, right? Or what are the ethical principles that underwrite democracy? That's a question a philosopher might ask, right? So humanities, from a historical perspective, right? If I'm a historian and I'm looking at Black Lives Matter, right? I may come at it from a few different ways. I may try and figure out what are the things happening in the world that led to its rise, right? Or I might contextualize it in the history of radicalism over the last 200 years and compare it to other movements. I might look at the imagery of Black social movements. How has it been portrayed in the media, right? That might be of interest to me. Is it being portrayed similarly to the civil rights movement in the 60s? Is it being portrayed differently? I might look at it in the context of other responses to racism, of any kind of racism in America. So there's a lot of different ways I might approach it if I'm a historian. The fourth large group of disciplines is the applied sciences. This is where you take knowledge from the other disciplines and you apply it, okay? So an engineer, for example, is applying mathematical concepts. A nurse is taking concepts from the natural and life sciences, right? Computer scientists, forensics, these are fields where they take knowledge from the other disciplines and they use them in a practical way in the real world. And similarly, so lots of work is being done right now by lots of people in applied fields looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. If you read the news and you see discussion of how health outcomes are really different for African Americans with COVID-19, that's an example of applied science. If you look at criminal justice reform movements, that's taking data and insights and using it to try and do practical work. Another example of an applied science would be like looking at algorithms and how they reinforce discrimination. So in other words, like police departments now use algorithms to tell them like where crime's going to happen, and it tends to reinforce discrimination and focus on neighborhoods that have already been kind of deemed as high crime. Public policy is another practical application where you might look at housing law and think about how that has shaped things. So, oh great, I got to the end because I only had 15 minutes. So, all right, so that's just an overview of the fields. What you're going to do next is you're going to do the academic disciplines assignment, which is going to have another short video in there that is going to kind of it's going to go over some of the same material, but also show you some different stuff that is directly related to the assignment that I'm going to ask you to do. So I hope this was helpful in understanding and just getting kind of an overview of the academic disciplines. And what we're going to do over the course of the semester is do readings across the different disciplines and think about how they approach knowledge and how they approach problems and how they ask questions. So this is just kind of the beginning of this work.